Welcome back. Let's talk about a tax paid by the buyer. We want to know who bears the burden of that tax. And it's unlikely that the full burden of the tax is actually going to fall on the buyer. So let's think about a quick example and then we'll look at it in a diagram. So suppose that you want to buy some M&Ms and you're willing to pay $2 per package for M&Ms. But the government decides to impose a $1 tax. So as the buyer, you have to pay the tax. What does this scenario look like? So let's look at it without taxes and then with taxes, and then we'll look at it in a diagram. So without a tax, you've got your $2. You take those $2 to the convenience store, you pay the $2, and you get your M&Ms in return. Now the government comes along and they put a $1 tax on M&Ms. And this tax is supposed to be paid by the buyer. So you, as the buyer, as you're approaching the store, there's a guy standing there with a skinny tie, suit, sunglasses. It's the tax collector. He's here to take your $1. So you've got your $2, you're headed to the store to buy M&Ms, and of those $2, $1 goes to this tax collector. That means you've only got $1 that you can spend on M&Ms. So you can't buy the full package of M&Ms. Now you're going to have to buy a smaller package of M&Ms. You've got $1 for M&Ms, which means you can buy like half the amount of M&Ms that you were buying before. So you pay $1 to the government, you pay the other $1 for M&Ms, and you get some M&Ms, but not as many as before. That's the idea of inefficiency of taxes. So let's take a look at it in a supply and demand diagram. So thinking about a tax on the buyer, let's suppose that our original price is $2 and that the tax on the buyer, paid by the buyer, is $1. So we want to think about how do we model this in our model of supply and demand and who bears the burden of this tax. So let's start by just setting up a supply and demand model. So we've got price, quantity, throw in an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve, and let's label in our initial price and we'll call that P0. So we're going to end up with a fair amount of notation here. So maybe we should sort of put some notes down below about our notation. So this notation, so P0 is the original price. And we're maybe less concerned about quantity, but we can go ahead and label it in as well. All right, so we've got our model set up, and this world is cruising along, and then a tax is put in place. So what happens? Well, if you're a buyer and you know that if you go in to buy some M&Ms, you're going to have to pay a tax on those M&Ms. You're going to figure that in to how much are you willing to pay the store, knowing that you also have to pay the tax. Right? So the buyers are going to price in that tax. So buyers price in the tax. So how do they price in that tax? Well, it looks an awful lot like a reduction in their income. They have less that they can actually spend on goods at the store because they have to also pay this tax. Right? So when the buyers price in the tax, what does that look like? It looks like a reduction in demand. So now we can go put this over in our supply and demand model and see what it looks like. So let's think that demand is reduced. So demand shifts to the left. All right, how far does it shift? Well, it shifts until the vertical distance, right? The vertical distance is our price. Until that vertical distance is the amount of the tax. So demand shifts down by the amount of the tax. Now, usually when we talk about a reduction in demand or an increase in demand, it's a story about demand shifting left-right. How come now we're saying demand shifts down by the amount of the tax? Because it's buyers pricing in this tax. They're adjusting how much they can pay for an item. Well, if we're thinking about pay and price, etc., where does that show up? It's on our vertical axis. So this is the unusual case where really demand is shifting left, but how far left is it shifting until that vertical distance is the tax. So demand effectively shifts down by the amount of the tax. So we've got a reduction in demand. Well, how far is it? So demand shifts down, we'll put that in quotes, shifts down by the amount of the tax. Okay, so now we're starting to make a mess of our diagram. What's the result of this? Where are we? So after demand has shifted, where does it cross the supply curve? So we find this new point. So we've got a new price and a new quantity. So this is the quantity after the tax is imposed. So we'll call it Q sub T. What about this price though? What the heck is this thing? So this is the price that is being paid to the store or to the seller. So let's call this P sub S. So P sub S is the amount paid to the store or seller. But we're not done, right? Because we said that this is a tax that's on the buyer. The buyer has to pay the tax. So they're paying the store some amount, and then they've got to pay this tax as well. So this, if we just find our point, that P sub S, and we go straight up, right? Straight up. How far up do we go? We go up by the amount of the tax. Well, that takes us back to this original demand curve, right? If the new demand curve shifted down by the amount of the tax, then if we add the tax back, we end up back on that original demand curve. So what is this thing up here then? What is this sort of price? Well, let's call it P sub B. And I know we're getting jargony. Hang on, we'll put numbers on it in just a second and see if it makes a little more sense. So P sub B is the total amount that's paid by the buyer. So total amount paid by the buyer. So how much is the buyer paying in total? Well, it's what they pay to the seller, so P sub S, plus then they have to pay the tax. So if we said that our original price, maybe for a bag of M&Ms, is like $2, that means P naught is $2. And if the difference between PS and PB is this tax, then the gap between those two has to be our $1 tax. So let's suppose that the price was $2. Once this tax is put in place, now the buyer pays the seller $1.50. So they go in to buy M&Ms. They say, I can't pay as much as I did before because now I got to pay this tax. So they're only willing to pay $1.50 to the seller. They pay that $1 tax, and the total price then to the buyer ends up being something like $2.50. So what's important to notice here? Each side is bearing some amount of the burden from this tax. So before, the buyer paid $2 and the seller received $2. Now, the seller's only getting $1.50 for that bag of M&Ms. And the buyer is paying $2.50 for that bag of M&Ms. So the price has gone up to the buyer, and the amount received by the seller has gone down. So both sides are bearing some burden of this tax. Where can we see that? So let's start with the buyer. So the buyer is paying more than they were before, right? This vertical distance between what they were paying and what they are paying now. So in this case, $2 up to $2.50. They're paying 50 cents more, and that's on each bag of M&Ms that they buy. So the increase in price and across the entire quantity. So this rectangle, all of that is the extra amount in total that the buyer has to pay because of this tax. The increase per unit times the number of units. So this is the buyer's burden. It's how much of the tax revenue raised falls on the buyer's shoulders. Now, what about the burden that the sellers bear? They're receiving less than before, right? So they're only getting $1.50 instead of $2, and that's true for every unit sold. So we have this other rectangle below the original price, right? This one in here. What is that? Well, this is the seller's burden. So this is how much of that tax revenue raised, how much of that burden is falling on the seller's shoulders. Maybe the last thing that we should make a quick note about is the tax revenue. Right? So the tax revenue, how much is raised, is equal to the per unit tax times the quantity. That's the quantity sold after the tax is put in place. Right? So the per unit tax of $1 times the quantity. So what is that equal to? It's equal to the buyer's burden plus the seller's burden. So the tax revenue raised, the burden of that is being split across the two parties. Yes, the buyer is physically paying the tax, but the seller is still bearing some of the burden as well. Hopefully you're starting to get a feel for how you can think about taxes in a supply and demand diagram, and we'll see you next time.